Hi, this is Keith Hall again. Welcome back to Economics 590, the federal budget process. In these slides, we want to talk about the power of the purse. In other words, we want to talk about the roles of Congress and the president in the federal budget as set out in the Constitution. In this slide, we want to talk about the constitutional powers of the president. And in summary, let's just say the Constitution explicitly gives the president the power to do four things: sign or veto legislation, command the armed forces, ask for the written opinion of the cabinet, convene or adjourn Congress, and grant reprieves and pardons and receive ambassadors. The constitutional powers explicitly given to Congress, there are 7 of those, are to 1, make laws, 2, declare war, 3, raise and provide public money and oversee its expenditure. And this is the power of the purse. 4, impeach and try federal officers. 5, approve presidential appointments. 6, approve treaties negotiated by the executive branch. And 7, oversight and investigations. So let's look at the current budget process. Congress still dominates because the explicit language in the Constitution is no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And you see that term appropriations pop up quite a lot in looking at the federal budget. Congress makes the laws, including decisions about how much to spend on federal programs. This power of the purse has perhaps been the most important power of Congress. It's certainly been the main tool by which Congress has historically limited the power of the president. Here are some notable examples of use of the power of the purse. Some examples that worked and some examples that didn't work. One that worked occurred in 1974. The Foreign Assistance Act passed by Congress eliminated funding for South Vietnam and thereby ended the Vietnam War. 2007, the House of Representatives passed a supplemental war budget that set the timeline on the presence of troops in Iraq. That didn't get out of the House of Representatives. It didn't get passed by all of Congress. If it had, this might have ended the Iraq War by use of the purse. In the 1980s, Congress passed a law that withheld federal highway funds to any state that did not raise the drinking age. Well, of course, it turns out that federal highway funds are very important for states and their highways. And this was an effort to use the power of the purse to increase the power of Congress, not over the president, but in this example, but over states. In fact, this did work because the law really forced many states to raise the drinking age to 21 to maintain their federal funding for highways. In 2009, there was another attempt, the Affordable Care Act legislation. There was a desire by Congress to force states to expand the eligibility of Medicaid to more people. And in the Affordable Care Act, there was language that withheld Medicaid funding for any state that did not expand eligibility. And that failed because the Supreme Court reviewed it and overturned the law as unduly coercive. So what you see now is because of the Affordable Care Act, some states have expanded Medicaid voluntarily, and some states haven't. And everybody still gets their Medicaid funding despite this effort to use the power of the purse. So let's look more at the current budget process. For the president, here are the important pieces. We'll, of course, look at this in more detail later. First is the president's required to submit an annual budget. Even though it's an annual budget, it's simply a set of budget priorities for Congress to consider. And the reason it's just a bunch of priorities set out is that Congress is under no obligation to adopt any of the president's budget and often make significant changes in the president's budget. Again, this is them exercising the power of the purse. However, the president does have some leverage. The president may veto spending bills. So Congress may be reluctant to completely ignore the president because the president can always veto a spending bill and prevent the funding of the government. And then in addition to that, very importantly, the executive branch implements budget decisions. So Congress allocates money to different agencies, Treasury, HHS, agriculture. But the executive branch then, within those guidelines, makes decisions on how the money is spent, how the budget is implemented. When we talk about the federal budget, it's important to realize that the federal budget is not a single document. It, in fact, a number of different pieces of legislation. So once the president submits a budget, Congress has a few steps. For the first step is they create something called the budget resolution. You need to remember that term. And that's a setting of priorities. It's sort of a blueprint that Congress wants to use to fund the government. So it has some idea of what sort of level of spending, level of revenue the government's going to have, and roughly where they want the spending to be. But the second stage is then they need to put together multiple pieces of legislation that specifically authorizes and reauthorizes federal programs. The legislation could change federal tax laws, and it could provide and needs to provide funding for federal programs. All of these laws constitute the budget, and some or all of them can pass at the same time, or they can pass in pieces. The process for considering this legislation is complicated. There are many laws, lots of rules, lots of procedures that affect the proposal and the consideration of spending and tax legislation. The processes that they use and the procedures have been developed over time and are overlapping. And the form of these processes and procedures varies. Some are statutory, some are rules and protocols that have just been set out. Some are just guidelines agreed to by Congress and whatever administration's in power. And interpreting and applying all these rules, procedures, and laws is complicated, and interpreting them and applying them can be difficult. So just briefly, before 1921, there was not a lot going on in the budget. There was no coordination of the budget. There was no attempt within the budget to set priorities. The only thing that dominated was something called the Anti-Deficiency Act, where Congress must appropriate money for any federal agency to spend any money. So this sort of still exists today, and it stops any federal agency from spending money that Congress has not appropriated to them. And this is how the government winds up shutting down at times because of this Anti-Deficiency Act. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 really set out basically the current budget process. It set out that the president was required to submit a consolidated budget. It created something called the Bureau of the Budget, which is now the Office of Management and Budget. It created something called the Government Accountability Office. And then in 1974, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act enhanced and centralized the budget capacity in Congress. In fact, it was a deliberate attempt by Congress to wrestle back some budget authority from the president. And it created a couple of more institutions. It created budget committees. There's a budget committee in the Senate and a budget committee in the House, and those committees exist to sort of manage the budget process in Congress. And it created something called the Congressional Budget Office, which is designed to assist Congress in producing a budget every year and assessing legislation. And it created something called a budget resolution. And this is that blueprint that we talked about, that Congress is supposed to set out every year. Then there's lots of subsequent legislation. This is where it gets even more complicated. Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 95, Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010, Budget Control Act of 2011, bipartisan budget acts. Particularly interesting ones that the 1990 created something called Pay-Go and created budget spending caps. The Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act created something something similar to the caps, continued Pay-Go. Budget Control Act of 2011 again set out budget caps another time, and we're currently under these budget caps. But generally, the goal of these subsequent efforts were to focus efforts on specific levels of deficit reduction. As we've already established, looking at trends for the United States and other countries, there have been long-time deficits, and the budget process has not been very good at reducing deficits or even controlling deficits. And other goals are to establish, restructure, and reinstitute control over the budget process. So we've got things like sequestration, Pay-Go, and budget caps that are all trying to do this. We'll talk more about those later, of course. And then last, I just want to mention the common criticisms of the budget process. One, the budget process has not produced sustainable outcomes. So if you outspend your revenues year after year after year, that's not sustainable. At some point, that's just going to collapse, and that's going to create real problems for not just Congress and the government, but for all of us. The scoring rules and practices that control the process often interfere with things. They're often manipulated by Congress. Congress sets up their own rules, and then they set up ways to work around it. The rules and practices invite gimmicks, ways of working around the rules. And then they wind up driving the process. So to run the process, you really got to know all these rules and practices and try to control them. Also, the budget process doesn't get finalized in time. In fact, we talked about how important the budget resolution is as part of the process. It's the blueprint for how they're going to proceed. Well, Congress doesn't even get resolutions done. There have been literally no resolutions since 10 times since 1974. Resolutions are almost always late. In fact, there were 5 consecutive years. In addition to these 10 times, there was no resolution. The 5 years in a row from 2010 to 2014 where there was no budget resolution. And the budget process doesn't foster compromise. Whenever the resolution does get done, minority members just don't vote for it. They always vote against it. So since 1980, literally no minority members have literally ever voted for one of these budget resolutions. That's no compromising. And no resolutions received more than a handful of minority votes since 1997. So even prior to 2008, there's been very, very little compromise. Anyway, that's a brief discussion of the power of the purse. Thanks for listening.